Good morning. Can you hear me? Okay, good morning to our audience here in Cambridge. Our guest this morning joins us live from Australia. Julie Gillard was the 27th Prime Minister, the first and only woman to hold that position. And she's just co-written a new book, Women and Leadership, Real Lives, Real Lessons. And she joins us now. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Patrick. I can hear you, but only softly. If you could speak up a little bit, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear us now? Is that a bit better?
A little bit louder.
Okay.
Aha, perfect.
Good evening and, well, good morning to those of us here. I want to ask you about that introductory sentence. You've probably heard it hundreds of times, the first and only female Prime Minister. How does one lead when there is no path left by those who have gone before?
Well, I suppose being the first female Prime Minister, it's not like you didn't have any guidance about what the job was going to be about. I'd obviously watched male Prime Ministers in my country. I'd been Deputy Prime Minister, and I did have role models for female leadership. A great mentor and friend of mine was a woman called Joan Kirner, who was the first woman to be Premier of the state of Victoria. So all of those influences are brought to bear as I went about crafting my own style of leadership. But having said that, of course, there are some things that happen when you're the first, which are unexpected, which you couldn't war game in advance. And one of the things I'm really keen to do now in this time in my life is to share the lessons learned, to try and bring the experiences of other women leaders and the global research about women and leadership to people, particularly to young women who are aspiring to go on their own leadership journeys. I think there's a benefit if you can effectively have seen this movie before, and given I've had experiences of leadership, other women have, I think that there are things that we can share.
And on that note, what advice would you offer to young women who witness the differential treatment that women in positions of power receive and are potentially disinclined from pursuing a career in the public eye?
I think I am still having a little bit of a difficulty hearing. I think that was a question about advice for young women, and yep. I'll answer that question. What I might do in the meantime is also put these headphones in to see if that gives me just better access to the sound. So excuse me while I do that. I'll try and answer your question at the same time. In terms of advice for young women, first and foremost, the advice I always want to give is go for it, absolutely. Don't be persuaded from aspiring to be a leader just because there's still a gendered bit. Make sure that you absolutely go for it. I am conscious that when women like myself talk about some of the sexist slings and arrows, that perhaps inadvertently we're putting young women off from their own leadership journey. I don't want to do that, but I do want young women, when they go for it, to be forewarned and therefore forearmed. I wish we could say to young women emerging as leaders that their leadership will be spent in a gender equal world, but unfortunately that's not the case. It's likely that there will still be moments that they encounter where they are treated differently and lesser than men. We're able, through research and through the collective experience of women who have gone before, to identify what those moments are likely to be. And that puts young women in the position where they can get ready, forewarned is forearmed, to try and defeat those moments, break down those barriers when they happen.
Thank you. And turning now to sort of broader ideological questions, what does feminism mean to you?
Yeah, I'm afraid I didn't hear that at all.
What does feminism mean to you?
That's much better.
Okay, perfect. I think this has all been my fault. I've just discovered the power of sound.
No problems. I'm a veteran of dealing with mics, and sometimes they're not easy. Feminism, to me, fundamentally, just means the passionate belief that men and women are equal, coupled with the knowledge that we live in a world that has been designed basically by men, for men, and that we need to change much about that world if men and women are truly to have equal opportunities and equal lives. So for me, feminism means being committed to two sorts of change: to structural change, to amending, reforming institutions that have embedded gender biases in them, and to changing stereotypes, the whispering that happens in the back of all of our brains, which tries to tell us what men should be like and what women should be like.
And has your feminism changed over time? And if so, how?
Yes, I do think it's changed over time. I mean, I would have first described myself as a feminist way back when I went to university. I'm back in my hometown now, courtesy of the COVID pandemic, and I started university here in 1979, so it's quite a long time ago. And I got active in the first few years of university around a federal government cutback to education. I got involved in the campaign to try and push back against those cuts. And that got me increasingly involved in student politics, student unionism, and there I learned a great deal more about feminism. And at that time, there was some quite strong divisions in the on-campus women's movement between women who believed in a very separatist approach to feminist organising. They wanted to be in women's only spaces, only working with women, creating new ways of being. They didn't want to go into the union structures, the structures that had been defined by men. And then there were women like myself who believed that we needed to be involved in the places that decisions were made and to make sure that women's voices were fairly represented in those decisions. Now, that brand of feminism has been with me all of my life. But I think I've changed to the extent that whilst I, throughout my life, have been an analytical, a kind of can-do feminist wanting to bring change, the relentlessness of politics means I haven't had much time or space to simply feel the emotion of the sisterhood, to revel in women's achievement, to enjoy being with other women, sharing stories and insights. And in this period of my life's time, I get more opportunity to do that and feel a greater attraction to that.
Thank you very much for that answer. Changing track slightly. About a year ago, this society debated the motion, this house believes men can't be feminists. I was wondering what your take was on that. Does the fact that men just don't have those life experiences mean that they should stay out of feminist discourse?
I feel like I should ask you who won the debate before giving my answer, but I'm very happy to give an answer. I think men can call themselves feminists if they believe that men and women are equal and they're prepared to do something about it. And I believe men can be allies in the struggle for gender equality. What they shouldn't do is try and push women out of the way and take leadership of that struggle. They should be supporters and allies. In this world where power positions are still disproportionately held by men, to give just one statistic from the world of politics, my world, 70% of nations on earth have never been led by a woman. So power still disproportionately lies in the hands of men. So if we don't get men involved in this journey of change, basically it will take us a lot longer to see the profound reforms that we need. So I do think men can be feminists, they can act as feminists, they can be allies and supporters. What they shouldn't seek to do is dominate the movement.
And whilst we're talking about world leaders and the political arena, Has the pandemic shown that women lead in a different manner to men?
Yeah, I'm always really careful of questions like this because it, in some ways, can bake the sexist stereotyping in. I am not a believer that, men's brains and women's brains are somehow inherently different. There's been all of this dialogue over time that, men are from Mars, women are from Venus. And in my book on women and leadership, which I co-authored with my great friend, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, we spend some time on this, quoting particularly the work of a wonderful Australian academic, a woman called Cordelia Fine, who examines the neuroscience and concludes that a lot of this men are from Mars, women are from Venus stuff is really neurosexism. There aren't big inherent differences in men and women's brains, which means that they necessarily act differently or indeed lead differently. But we are socialised differently, and the way people see leaders is different based on gender. There is very good quality research that we come to different assumptions about male and female leaders. So a man who is, pushy, ambitious, self-interested will be viewed as a go-getter. A woman who is like that will be viewed as unlikable, a bit of a bitch, not the sort of person that you want to know. And consequently, all of that stereotyping and socialisation means that for women leaders to come through in areas that need public support, like politics, they do need to weave together strength and empathy. They've got to be seen to combine enough toughness to get the job done. But if they are seen to have not be empathetic, to not be nurturing, then it's unlikely that they will attract electoral support. People will think that they've given up on the feminine traits, and people will be very judgmental about that. And so the women who tend to come to the fore in politics do weave together strength and empathy. And in a period of history like this, I think they are the kind of leadership traits that people are looking for. People want to understand that their leaders have got the ability to get their nation through, but they also want their leaders to show enough emotional intelligence about how people are feeling. There has also been some research coming out of the UK where outcomes in the pandemic have been analysed against the gender of leaders. Nations led by women have been compared to comparable nations, and the researchers have concluded that nations led by women have done better. They can't quite answer the question why, but they speculate it is because women have been more prepared to take the scientific advice and to act earlier in the face of that advice. So they were quicker to implement lockdowns and other public health measures that have successfully contained the virus.
Speaking of the book, obviously you spoke to a phenomenal range of women leaders when writing the book. I was wondering, very often you've spoken about how the challenges women leaders in different parts of the world face are very similar. What do you think the main similarities and differences are?
Yeah, whether the challenges were similar or different was one of the things we wanted to interrogate in the book. We interviewed 8 women leaders from cultures and contexts as different as Liberia in Africa, which is one of the poorest countries on earth, racked for many years by civil war and then needing to face up to the Ebola epidemic. A country like that and the leadership of President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf against a country like Norway, which is one of the most rich countries in the world, one of the richest, and also one of the most gender equal societies in the world. And we interviewed Erna Solberg, who is Prime Minister. And we wanted to interrogate this question about, how much is different and how much is the same. And a lot of things are different because culture and context is different. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's leadership journey has got periods of imprisonment, of exile, of physical danger. Obviously, Erna Solberg has not had to go through any of that. And yet, with all of those differences, some of the manifestations of sexism and some of the conclusions these women came to were the same. Both were keenly aware that they would be judged on how they dressed. Both were aware of being judged on their family structures and parenting arrangements. both felt that they were on a tightrope about showing strength and empathy, and if they fell off the tightrope that they would be judged harshly. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf talks about being president and going to meetings of the African Union with presidents and prime ministers and being the only woman and still feeling that she was being judged based on gender. And Erna Solberg talks about, being in rooms of all men where she felt the same kind of judgment. So I ultimately, absorbing all of this and working with my co-author Ngozi, we put the perspective that the amplitude of the difference that gender and sexism makes is different in different places in the world, but the inherent nature of that sexism is actually surprisingly very much the same.
And in terms of your own leadership journey, I'm just wondering, are there any things you would have done differently in responding to the sexism you faced throughout your political career?
Yes, there are things that I would have done differently. I made an error, a telling error. When I became Prime Minister, I assumed that the maximum reaction to me being the first woman to lead the nation would manifest in the early period of my Prime Ministership. And by the maximum reaction, I mean both the maximum positive and negative reaction. So the kind of, go girl, it's great that we've got a woman leader reaction, as well as the maximum discomfort about having the first woman. And then people would get over that, they'd work their way through it, they'd get over it, and then I would be viewed and treated as other Australian Prime Ministers have been viewed and treated. And we have a very robust political culture. We're not all that polite. So, our question time is a very vigorous one. So I was expecting all of that. I had that factored in, but I thought the gendered bit would fall away. What I actually found was the longer I was Prime Minister, you make difficult decisions, ones that people like, ones that people don't like. The longer I was Prime Minister, the more gendered the environment became, the more likely it was that people would use sexist tropes or insults against me. And by the time that was happening, if I pointed it out, it was quite easy for people to say, well, she's only pointing that out now, not because it's genuinely a problem about sexism, but because she's in political trouble. And so by making this misjudgment, I think I missed the moment when I had the maximum power to actually shine a spotlight on the sexism. Having said that, one of the conclusions I've walked away with is that we should not put all of the burden of calling out sexism on the shoulders of a woman who's in the middle of it all. Actually, that's a shared burden. We should all be calling out and pointing to sexism. And if anything, it can be easier for us who are not in the middle of it to see it and say it than it can be for the woman at the centre of it.
I want to, if I may, rewind to the morning of the 9th of October 2012, just whilst you were delivering your famous speech on misogyny, which was voted the most memorable moment on Australian television. What was going through your mind as you were delivering it, and did you expect it to leave the indelible mark that it left on Australian politics?
Oh no, I most certainly did not expect it to leave a mark. I mean, at one level, this was just another parliamentary day, and to explain a little bit about our parliament, we don't have the British nicety of Prime Minister's parliamentary questions, not for us. We have a question time every day that the House of Representatives sits. It's about an hour and a half. The Prime Minister is expected to be in question time every day. And inevitably, that means that most questions are directed towards the Prime Minister. And so, if you're Prime Minister of Australia, question time with all of its rough and tumble and catcalling and interjections and all the rest of it, the wall of sound, question time is a part of each and every parliamentary day. And I knew in this parliamentary day that we would end up, having a day that was about sexism. The person I'd supported to be Speaker of the House of Representatives had been unmasked as someone who'd sent very sexist text messages. Now, I could not have known that at the time that we supported him to be Speaker, but nevertheless, I expected that the opposition would be using question time to sort of challenge me on hypocrisy grounds, that being a known feminist, I had supported this man. And so I went into question time prepared for that. What actually happened is, instead of question time, the Leader of the Opposition moved a motion of censure. And so what has become known as the misogyny speech is my speech in reply to that motion. And I knew from the dynamics of the House of Representatives, where I'd spent many a long year arguing for many things, I knew that the speech had landed powerfully in that chamber, but I had no sense that it would resonate beyond the chamber around the world, or that we would be talking about it, this number of years later. No sense at all.
And why do you think it did resonate, particularly with women around the world?
Well, I think for women around the world, obviously they weren't judging the context of Australian politics that day. They likely don't know anything about Australian politics, understandably. So I think for them, it has come to be almost a battle anthem, almost the thing you listen to when you've been subject to some sexism yourself, and you wish that in that moment you'd had a great retort. And I think we've all lived through episodes like that in our lives, when we've woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning, sort of, if only I'd said, because then the, perler zinger line is on the tip of your tongue. But unfortunately, it wasn't on the tip of your tongue when it happened. I think for women, the misogyny speech has come to represent a moment when a woman did stand her ground and had the opportunity to lay it out, to say it. And so I think there's been a resonance in that for women who haven't always had that opportunity.
Thank you. Let's turn to a couple of questions from our audience.
I'm truly hoping you can't hear the dog snoring in the background. There's very audible snoring my end.
We can't, I'm sure. Do we want to start with your question? Thank you. Oh, sorry. Is it? Okay, we'll go on this side then. Okay, so can we try on this side?
Hello?
Hello,
Hi.
I can hear you.
Hi, my name's Sharina. Thank you very much for this morning. I think it's been amazing to hear your story, and I'm someone I've followed you for a long time. I heard very early on you talked about the whispers in your head, and I wanted to just pick up on that point to find out a little bit more about how you've dealt with imposter syndrome, and how you've kind of overcome perhaps, the whispers in your head, and what advice you'd have for us as we're kind of battling through our journeys and our own imposter syndromes.
Sure. Well, I think first and foremost, I'd say the whispers are in everybody's head, because we all live in a gendered world. We carry them with us. And a really important thing is to be aware of them. And one of the things we do in the book is we cite some tremendous research, including, research from Yale University, where they've got two groups of voters, put them in different rooms, sent a man into one room to pitch for votes, a woman into the other room to pitch for votes. Actually, they're both actors, and they've given them exactly the same script, and they're testing what difference gender makes. And when the man uses lines like, "I'm the kind of person who gets things done, I might step on people's toes, but I always deliver," that's fine. When a woman says exactly the same words, the audience really hates it. They don't like it. And they actually poll the audiences at the end, and less people would vote for a woman who said those kinds of lines. And less men and less women would vote for her. So the whispers are in all of our heads. And we're only going to get rid of those whispers by knowing that and shining a light on them. And then for women, I think we take those whispers and we allow them to have implications for our own self-confidence, because there aren't as many role models, because women are still fewer in number in leadership positions. It's easy for women to, get the chatter in their head that this is not a role for them, this is not a place for them, this is not something that they could do. What I hope you will find reassuring is we talked to 8 of the most powerful women in the world, and they have those whispers in their head. So, you shouldn't view those whispers as disabling. You should recognise them and recognise that they can be overcome because other women have pushed through. And also, I wouldn't necessarily always label those whispers as a bad thing. An academic who I think does tremendous work, an Argentinian academic called Professor Tomorrow Chamorro Pre-Music, has studied confidence and competence. And we easily correlate those two. We think that a confident person is going to be a competent person. But he's unpacked all of that and actually found that leaders who have self-doubt, who work through things a second time, who acknowledge in their heads that they might not have got every judgment call right, actually make better quality leaders than the person who just confidently says each and every time, you know what, I've got this. So, in some ways, that voice in your head, don't let it be disabling, but also don't be dismissive of it. There's nothing wrong with thinking and thinking again about the road that you've embarked on, the things that you want to do.
Thank you. Is your microphone working?
Hi. Is this working?
Oh, great. Thanks.
Yes, I can hear you.
Hi, Julia. My name's Eliza. Thank you so much for such an insightful talk. I vividly remember when you became Prime Minister, because I was in an all-girls high school at the time and the excitement was palpable. We were all thrilled to finally have our first female Prime Minister. And then within the year, we also had our first female Governor-General and our first female Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of my state, Victoria. So I remember when we left school, we felt, honestly, that the world was ours for the taking. And having just had my 10-year reunion, I can say that the general experience seems to be that feeling of elation was well and truly shattered once we entered the various professional realms that we had decided to enter. And your book and your speech has given us very valuable advice for individual women as to how we can tackle these obstacles. But sometimes they can feel just truly insurmountable for one person. And so I'm curious as to whether, in your experience or in the research, there are any particular strategies or approaches we can take on a societal level to try and accelerate the change that needs to happen in how we perceive and receive women leaders?
That's a really good question, and we talk about feminism coming in waves for a reason, I think, because the nature of feminist history tells us that for every wave of change that takes us forward, there does tend to be a bit of a backlash. It's not linear and it's too slow, and so there are moments when all of us can feel quite disheartened about the nature of the progress being made. So I'm sorry that you've already had a bit of that experience, thinking that perhaps the new normal in Australia was going to be women's leadership, or at least an equal number of women leaders, and that hasn't been the lived reality since my time in politics. I do think that quite a number of the solutions are collective solutions. Of course, in writing a book like this, we're conscious that women will read it as an individual advice, but so many things that go to make a more gender equal society need to be delivered collectively. And one of the big things that struck me in writing the book is the women who come from countries that have had more than one female leader and have got progressive policies about gender all describe the amount of space they have as a woman leader as a far more generous amount of space. You know, to take an example of that, Jacinda Ardern is crystal clear that she's got more space to be the kind of leader she wants to be, to foreground kindness as the watchword of her leadership, to not worry that that's going to lead into some argument about, oh, you know, women are too weak to lead because they just want to be kind to each other, because she is the third woman to lead her nation. New Zealand is one of only 2 countries on earth that's had 3 women lead, and Jacinta is the third. And Erna Solberg in Norway, you know, crystal clear that the very pro-gender equality policies that have been adopted in Norway over years now have made a difference. You know, things like the fact that in Norway, on the birth of a new baby, there's paid parental leave for the mother and paid parental leave for the father. And if the father doesn't take the leave, he loses it. He can't transfer it to the mother. And so in Norway, men take extended periods of time off when children are born, which means that the family gets into the pattern of more equalised caring for the child between the man and the woman. And studies have shown that years later, that more equal approach to caring for a new baby shows as more equal parenting for children. You know, really remarkable results can be shown 5 years on about the difference in parenting styles because men have had that experience. And so that, I think, is telling us that getting to gender equality, getting to more space for women leaders is about collective action through governments. It's about corporations and other organisations being prepared to embrace change. It's about structures, whether they're political structures, business structures, civil society structures, legal structures, asking themselves some very deep questions about embedded sexism and how they can get rid of it. And it's about keeping at it so that we have more women come forward, because I think it's undeniable the more women who lead, the easier it becomes for the next woman and the next woman and the next woman. So yes, there's an interplay here between how we think about ourselves and design our own pathways forward and how we join hands and campaign together for collective change.
Do we have any more questions? If you don't have access to a microphone, I can repeat your question. Okay, I'm gonna steal another one then. We have a lot of first-year university students with us today, freshers joining us both in person and on the live stream, many of whom will be starting out their political journeys, won't necessarily know the best way of pursuing activism. What particular concrete steps do you think they should take to address the societal injustices they see around them?
Well, I think for me, if I can draw on my own experience to answer that question, for me, my activism was born because I found the cause I cared about, or in some ways, that cause found me. I grew up in a family home that very much valued education because neither of my parents had had the opportunity to finish secondary school. And both of them were intelligent people, and they very much regretted that they'd had to leave school early. My father, simply because of poverty, left school at the age of 14. My mother had a lot of ill health as a child in an era when there was no system for helping a child that missed a lot of school catch back up. So she drifted away from high school and didn't complete either. And both of them always had this very wistful sense of what if we'd been able to finish school, what if we'd been able to go on to further study after school. And so they weren't going to let my sister or I miss that opportunity. You know, the power, the importance, the transformation that can come with education was drummed into us as children. And when I did get to go to university and saw the potential for government cutbacks to take an opportunity to go to university in a well-resourced university away, I thought that was wrong. And it was that sense of purpose that propelled me into the activism. I wanted to change the government's mind about those cutbacks. And the collective campaign we engaged in did change the government's mind about some of those cutbacks, not all of them, but some of them. And, you know, insert lifetime of activism here, but that's what got me started. And so for young people who are starting out, I guess my advice would be, don't fall in love with the mechanics of activism, fall in love with the cause. And if you fall in love with the cause, whatever is the thing that really makes you animated, excited, wanting to make a difference in the world, then the techniques of activism will follow. But it's the energy that comes from the cause that's most important.
And continuing with activism, a lot of people found that during the pandemic, when they were locked down, it was very difficult to organise. There was this atomization, particularly of our generation, but there was a great deal of mobilising, particularly on social media. How did you find the pandemic affected you politically, in the sense that how did it limit your ability to communicate your message? And how did you overcome that?
Yeah, it's such a different world, isn't it? I mean, my normal life is to travel extensively, to spend 3 months of the year in the UK doing work with the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College, to travel extensively in my capacity as chair of the Global Partnership for Education. And we've had to substitute for all of that virtually. And I think we've done that well. You know, we've been able to keep things going, but there's an energy that comes when people can be in the same physical space and strategising together, taking action together, that I'm missing, and I think the teams at the Global Institute and the Global Partnership for Education are missing too. It's, you know, the online substitutes give us some opportunities, but not all of the same opportunities. I guess, you know, there's no magic solution here. It is going to be like this for a while yet. We're learning some things about virtual activism in this period that we can take with us, and that's a good thing. But we will be able to return to a world where people once again can gather in numbers and have animated discussions and decide to do things together to have an impact in the world, and I'm certainly looking forward to that.
You spoke earlier on in our conversation about some of your mentors. I was just wondering, shifting perhaps to the future tense, looking around the world and seeing young female leaders, where do you draw your inspiration from with regards to the next generation?
Yeah, I do get the opportunity to look around the world and to see young women coming up. I particularly get the opportunity to do that through my involvement as the patron of the Campaign for Female Education, which is there in Cambridge, led by some terrific women, Lucy Lake, who lives there, and it is a scholarship model, but really a model of female empowerment in Africa. And so it assists girls to finish secondary school and then to find their pathways beyond secondary school. And what I see through that work is a coming generation of young African women who have found their voice, who understand their power, and who are dedicated to making change in their communities. And when I see that, it gives me a lot of optimism and hope.
On that note of optimism and hope, we thank you very much for joining us. Julie Gillard, thank you so much.
Thank you. Been lovely to be able to be with you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a really uplifting and inspirational talk. This week we have the no confidence debate on Thursday night, featuring Jacob Rees-Mogg on the government side, as well as prominent Labour Party politicians on the other side. The ballot for that is, I believe, still open. And our term card, which features many female leaders, including Theresa May, who was one of the contributors to Julia Gillard's book, is out now, so feel free to check that out. We hope you have a great day. Thank you for joining us. Good morning.
Thank you.